Well, greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to this part 2 video in the Steampunk Amp video series. In part 1, the cabinet was designed and fabricated. Now we're ready to apply the finish and the final details to the cabinet and to construct and install the amplifier that it will contain. And of course, in the end, we'll do the sound check to make sure that it sounds as good as it looks. If this sounds interesting, then pull up an easy chair, grab a beer, and get ready because we're headed back to the workshop. Well, now it's time to apply the finish to our Steampunk amplifier cabinet. And step 1 will be to completely disassemble it and remove all of the accessories, bezels, and other things that have been attached. Now that all the external accessories have been removed, the cabinet is broken down into its 4 basic parts. Since the paint will be slightly transparent, blemishes and spots and other things like that will have to be sanded out, and also edges and all the finer details have to be completed before the paint is applied. Also, the surfaces will have to be thoroughly scrubbed and degreased. Before spraying the outside of the cabinet, I thought it would be good to spray the interior with a nice reflective aluminized silver. A viewer recommended that I try some VHT, that high temperature paint that they use for car engines. So I checked, and they had a color called burnt copper that was absolutely gorgeous. So I've sprayed all the metal parts with this, and then done about 3 or 4 coats of clear over it. So I thought you'd get a kick out of how this looks in the sun. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I'm very thankful for the viewer's advice. I've been baking the paint in the sun for several hours. Here's the front of the base. The rivets turned out pretty nice, I think. Here's the control panel for the rear. Really turned out nice and glossy. And last but not least, the main body of the cabinet. I thought it turned out really nice. And here are those frames and rings after they've been properly sealed and painted and clear coated. I think they turned out pretty nice. I think they would pass for metal. I hope they do. Now that the cabinet has been lightly compounded and waxed, it's time to put it all back together. Step 1 is we install the rubber feet on the bottom of the base. Step 2, I put felt pads in the interface between the base and the bottom of the cabinet. Then we bolt the base onto the amplifier cabinet with 1/4-inch bolts, nuts, and lock washer. Now we have the completed cabinet and base. Next, we'll install the handle brackets and handle, all with recessed screws and lock washers. Next, let's assemble the volume gauge. First, I took a digital photograph of the smaller potentiometer rings, blew it up to be exactly the right size for the volume gauge, and laminated it, and now I have glued it in place. Next, we're going to put the bezel and adapter ring down and screw them in. Next, I painted the needle silver so that it would stand out against the black dial, and assembled it with the pulley inside the cabinet. Now when the pulley moves on the inside, the needle moves right along with it. Then finally we install the adapter ring and a gauge bezel with glass to make our gauge complete. Now let's install the volume knob with its ring and then the pulley inside the cabinet. Now the volume knob, ring, pulley, and belt are all assembled, and as you can see, the volume dial moves in perfect harmony with the knob. Now let's install those two frames around the pilot light holes. And now the two frames are screwed snugly in place. I'm going to wait till the amplifier chassis is built and wired before I install the tone controls and tremolo controls and the high and low gain input. So that's about as far as we can go with the assembly of the amplifier cabinet and controls. Next we'll start machining the chassis and wiring it. Well, here's the chassis plate all machined for the output transformer, power transformer, the 5Y3 rectifier, 6V6 output tube, 212AX7s, and these two holes are for the pilot lights, which will be used in a way that you'll see shortly. Okay, so now it's time to drill the holes to mount the tube bases to the plate, and then we're ready to start wiring.
Well, it looks like the gang's all here. Ollie is waiting patiently by the food dish for her breakfast. And then, look who else has showed up. It's Rocky, her twin brother. Notice his ear is clipped. That means he's fixed. He's also feral as heck, but kind of finds a way to overcome that whenever the food is served. He's always first in line, like any big brother tends to be. So I guess it's time to get the old cat food out and start serving it up. And then, of course, there's our indoor feral cat who wants his share as usual. Hey, what's going on, Jackie? You a good boy, huh?
In a recent video, I showed you a very poorly packed Jensen speaker. Let's contrast that with this packing job, a package I just received. Look at all the packing material. Now look at this. Cardboard all the way around. That's the power transformer and the output transformer. Completely safe from injury. I mean, this thing could have been thrown out of the airplane in my front yard probably, and these would have survived. This is what a good packing job looks like in my book. And also, to give credit where credit is due, this shipment came from Amp Parts Direct. Well, most of the drilling and machining of the chassis plate is finished. You can see here for the power transformer, 5Y3, 6V6, and the 212AX7s. Then we turn it over and look to see what's underneath. All sorts of terminal strips here to assist with the wiring of the tubes. And then, because there's just not enough real estate here for the filter caps, I made like a shark fin here that is perpendicular to the chassis, and it will hold 320 microfarad at 450 volt caps. Now the volume control has been installed, as well as the power transformer and the rear control panel with the 4 and 8 ohm speaker outputs, fuse in the middle, and of course toggle and grommeted power cord input. And speaking of grommets, there they are. That's for the output transformer, which will be installed next. Alright, here's the underside of the chassis with all the components installed, including the output transformer through the grommeted holes. And here's the top of the chassis, output transformer, power transformer, tube sockets, and control panel with all components installed. Now it's time to start wiring. Well, the wiring's coming along pretty well. We have the high voltage wiring going over here to the plates of the rectifier, and the 5 volt filament wiring is going to the filament of the rectifier. Also, the 6.3 volt filaments for the 6V6 and the 212AX7s are all wired up. The output transformer secondary is connected to the 4 and 8 ohm output jacks. The primary has not been connected yet. Well, I've been working for several hours, so let's stop, take a break, and review what's been done here on the chassis. First off, those mysterious pilot light receptacles are in place and wired. The filter caps are all installed in their vertical doghouse. The output transformer is completely wired. Well, this is extra. This is not going to be used, so that doesn't count. And now the 6V6 is completely wired, and I'm now extending over here to the 12AX7s. Get the power cord installed and wired. So really we're down to the two 12AX7s now. Of course, one is for the tremolo, one is simply the preamp tube. Once they're finished, I believe this chassis will be ready to test. So enough flapping the gums, let's get back to work and finish it up. Since this is an unusual design with the two tone controls and the two tremolo controls mounted on the cabinet itself, not on the chassis, there's a problem with wiring the pots, which is why I created a piece of masonite to mimic the spacing of the pots in the cabinet face. Then I will take this piece of masonite and attach it to the front of the chassis plate, wire the pots with the proper length of wire to the positions that are necessary, and then when it's time to install the chassis in the amp, at the last minute each of the pots will be unscrewed from the masonite. As the chassis is slid in, each of the pots will be installed in the amp face. Here's the piece of masonite holding the four pots, and it is elegantly taped to the front of the chassis. Now it's time to do the wiring between the pots and these. Okay, here's a good example of how the masonite strip has helped me to wire the potentiometers above and below the chassis plate. As you can see, these are all shielded cables. Because of the length of the run, I felt that was essential, so the shielded cables pass through these grommeted holes and go down below to be connected. So the upper pots then are fully wired, and now it's time to look at the tremolo pots that reside beneath the chassis plate. Here is the preamp tube of the Vibrachamp circuit, completely wired with the tone controls connected. As you can see, even though the Champ circuit is fairly simple, when you compress the whole circuit down into a little small area like I've had to do with this particular chassis, things do get rather congested. Now the tremolo 12AX7 is completely wired and connected to the speed and intensity controls. Now all that's left is to wire the two input jacks, the high and low impedance inputs. Now, using these elegant supports, I have completely wired the high and low input jacks into the circuit. Let's take a quick drone flight over the circuit. Now that it is finished, so you can see every detail. Okay, I'd say it's time to put in some tubes and see if this beast works. Okay, I flipped the chassis over, inserted some tubes, and have plugged it in to the current limiter. Now I know a lot of people have all these elaborate startup procedures. Mine is just simply turn it on and see what happens, and whatever goes wrong, use that as a clue to figure out what you did wrong and repair it. So this is it, okay? No practices here. I'm going to turn this on and you will get to see it and hear it for the very first time. Okay, the toggle is on. Looks like we're getting some filament illumination. I've got the volume at about half. I've got a jack plugged in. Well, the amplifier part's working. Let's see about the tremolo. Now since I put 3 0.2 microfarad caps in the oscillation loop, hear how slow that is. Ah, that's perfect. Now we'll speed it up. Maximum speed. We'll go back to minimum speed. That's like 2 beats for every, say, 3 seconds. Nice and slow. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, it seems like this is going to work just fine. Okay, so now it's time to install it in the cabinet. Also, I must add that due to the long runs and separation of the controls from the chassis and the amount of shielded cable I had to use, I was very worried about a 60 cycle hum. But as you can hear, there is the slightest power hum, but absolutely no 60 cycle hum coming from this. So that is definitely a good discovery. Here's how the chassis looks from above. You can see the tubes and of course the 2 bubble tubes. I made these little metal shrouds here to conceal their Christmas nature, so all you see is the bubbling dichloromethane columns. Here's the chassis all lit up and bubbling its little heart out. The red bases on the bubble tubes really cast a nice glow off all the reflective surfaces within the amp. Very pretty. Alright, I'm sliding the chassis now into the cabinet, and I think you can see how the pots and jacks are going to line up, or at least come close. Then I can reach in and put them in place and hold them there while the outer nuts are tight. Here's a view from the rear of the amp with the chassis slid completely into place, and the volume knob and a volume pot have been connected. You can see that the potentiometers are installed in the face of the cabinet as well as the input jacks. Now it's time to install the back door. Here's the back door. I compounded it to smooth it out, make it a little shinier. I also had some fun with a homemade sticker that I printed on the computer. I just love the little skull and crossbones motif here and the lightning bolts. Okay, so now it's time to install the back door with the 3 machines. Here we have a rear view of the amplifier with the back door installed. The power cord is safely stashed in its little secret compartment down here in the support base. We see our safety sticker warning people to be careful. Nice ventilation holes, control panel, and with that final touch, the amplifier is now completed. Now that the amp is finished, let's take an up-close tour of all the details. The handle, top vent, bubble tubes and framed windows, special chicken head knobs with indicators, gears around the inputs, the volume control knob and volume control needle. And the back door. Control panel, warning sticker, and cord storage. Now let's plug it in and see how it looks lit up. Okay, here it is lit up with some external lighting. You can see the bubble tubes going to town. You can look down inside. That nice red glow from the bubble tube bases. Now let's turn off the external lighting. Here we are with most of the outside lights off. Look at that interior glow, like the inside of a volcano or a house of ill repute. Okay, we're out in the workshop with the mighty Steampunk amp connected to the equally mighty Ampro speaker cabinet. So let's strum a few chords through this duo and see how they sound. Let's start off with the tone and tremolo both down at 0. A little flat like you'd expect, just mid-range. Now let's crank the treble up to 50%. A little livelier. Now let's turn the bass up to 50%. Oh yeah, much warmer, much fuller. Now let's try the treble crank to 100%. Maybe a little too bright, which is just what you want with a treble control. Too little at 0 and too much at 100%, and so your happy place is somewhere in between. Now the treble back to 50 and the bass cranked all the way up. A little overboard on the bass, I think you'll agree, kind of boomy. So once again, the bass control seems to be working just right. Too little at 0, too much at 100. Now we'll set both the tone controls at 50% and we'll go with 50% intensity on the tremolo with the speed at the slowest possible. I think that's about as slow as a tremolo can go. That's with all 0.02 microfarad caps in the oscillation loop. Now we'll go with all controls at 50%. That seems like just about perfect tremolo to me. But for all you hogs out there in YouTube land, let's go to 100% intensity. And like the other two controls, too much intensity gives you really too much tremolo. So we'll crank it back to 50% and try the speed at 100%. That's fairly fast. I think actually it could be a little faster even at maximum setting, so I might do some fine-tuning in that respect. guess that's about it on this video extravaganza featuring the mighty steampunk amp. A couple quick messages. Number one, I had the treble turned up a little high on a few of those tunes, and I apologize. Number two, congratulations to Ed Wegert, the Patreon patron who won the Stage Right amp. He's already received it and seems quite happy, so we'll have to have more drawings like this in the future. Speaking of which, I wanted to say thanks again to all the Patreon patrons and PayPal contributors who have kept us on the air another month and completely advertising free. For those of you who would like to join them, I will have links in the video description to help you to do so. And now it's time to take off for a brief drone flight with backing track. This flight will take place in McKelligan Canyon Park in El Paso, Texas. I hope you enjoy it. I also hope to see you again in our next video.